Good morning, or I guess it's good afternoon for you. I'd just like to say thank you very much for the introduction, and it's an honor to be here at this conference. My relationship to McLuhan is very interesting. Can I have the next slide, please? I came to Toronto to go to art school in 1979, and that was the same year that McLuhan passed away. He had started the McLuhan program for culture and technology in the 1960s to explore the impact that media had on society. And I think, I'm maybe wrong, but I think he's one of the most well-known Canadians that's ever existed, especially in the world of this kind of idea of the philosophy of technology. Next slide, please. Now, McLuhan had an interesting insight. He saw art as a very important element in technology's development. He saw it as a distant early warning system, something like almost like the parakeet in the coal mine. He saw art as a way that would give society an inclination, an insight into how it was going to affect society in the future. Actually, McLuhan felt that new technology should be given to artists and not to commercial interests at first. Commercial interests will simply find ways to utilize it for the profit it can generate, which is obvious. But artists, on the other hand, are looking at a much more subtle insight into how this new technology is going to affect people in the future. So I was hired, next slide please. I was hired in 1993 to start something called VRock, which was the Virtual Reality Artist Access Program. And it was a way to actually take McLuhan's ideas and implement them in this new technology. The director of the program at that point was Dr. Derek de Kerkhoff, who saw art as something very, very important in this development of new media and its impact. So he was able to acquire funding to get a PictureTel video conferencing system. And I can see I'm using a Polycom system, and actually PictureTel went bankrupt and Polycom bought PictureTel. And he gave me access to this technology. And actually Toronto was a real hotbed for this kind of telepresence, virtual reality technology in the 80s and 90s. Alias Wavefront, people like David Rokeby, Bill Buxton, and the Ontario Telepresence project were all very important early developments in this development of looking at technology as a way to shape how society sees its implementation. Now, my own background is a bit strange. I mean, I hold 6 patents. I teach master's students. I'm a chief technology officer at my own company. And yet I have no true technical background. I went to art school, and I'm much better at breaking computer code than ever writing it. So I think to explain how I got to be here in front of you, well, sort of in front of you, I think I'd like to go back in time to where it all started. So next slide, please. So this was one of my very earliest works. It was my graduation project from art school, and it was the world's first telepresence art piece. I had developed what's called a head-mounted display, which is a device two tiny TVs in it, and it was linked to a live camera looking back at yourself, so you had a remote perspective. And it was a very interesting concept. No one was doing this kind of thing at that point. No one was exploring this idea of being able to take your eye and place it somewhere else to look back at yourself. And the kinesthetics of your movement you saw was quite fascinating. And it really taught me the power of this kind of new way of seeing. Next slide, please. Now, the first chance I got to work with Derek de Kerkhoff at the McLuhan program at the University of Toronto was in 1986. And Dr. de Kerkhoff was creating something which was a counterbalance to Ronald Reagan's idea of using technology for defense purposes. So he created a project that linked Salerno, Italy to the McLuhan program. And I developed a very early robot. There was one at the McLuhan program, and there was one in Salerno. And you could control the robot from Toronto in Salerno, but you couldn't control the robot that was next to you. It was this idea of remote presence. We also had Norman White, who had an arm wrestling machine. You could arm wrestle with someone over the internet. David Rokeby had a dance piece. It was all very, very avant-garde, but I don't know how the age of the people in the room, but in 1986, the internet, the web, I mean, it was nothing at all like it was today. So we had to use a modem where you could dial with a rotary telephone and wait for a beep. And then you would dock it into these two kind of plastic cups and hope that you would get a 300 baud modem link, which is about, I don't know, about 1 million times slower than this. So the problem with the piece was that it took about 4 hours to send a video image, whereas it's only taking about 1/30th of a second right now. But it did teach me that again, this new technology, is to be able to arm wrestle with someone, to touch someone over the internet. It was a fascinating idea. Next slide, please. Now, I had worked with panoramic imaging as an artist. I had become well known in a way to create panoramas and putting them into a computer environment. And I met the famous entrepreneur, Jaron Lanier, who basically invented the whole field of virtual reality. And he was involved in the same kind of idea, using head-mounted displays in virtual environments. And we combined our two companies. I created my first company called Horizon Scan. And we had been able to put real panoramic imaging into a VR environment. Now, again, the problem with entrepreneurship is you have to be at the right time, at the right place, at the right moment in technology's development. It costs about $20,000 US to put this kind of technology in place with a head-mounted display and a computer. I mean, and today, I can do the same thing with my iPhone. I can make a panorama and I can record it for a few $100s. So, the problem we had back in 1990 was that it was just so expensive. We were using SGI machines the size of refrigerators. It was just, the technology just hadn't caught up with the ideas yet. Next slide, please. And that's when Derek de Kerkhoff hired me after that company basically went bankrupt. He hired me as the director of VRock, and we started doing a series of projects using video conferencing, just like we are today, but in a much more artistic way. The first project we did was with the Venice Biennale in 1993, where I had a series of Toronto artists build miniature art rooms, like a museum. It was a miniature museum at the McLuhan program, made up of 12 rooms, and I built a small robot named Fred. And people in the Venice Biennale had a video conferencing system, and they could control Fred and drive it around and explore this miniature museum. And the fascinating thing was that unless they saw someone actually walking past them, they had no idea of the scale. And people thought we had created a 20,000 square meter installation somehow. And it wasn't until you picked up the camera and you showed them what it was that this illusion was broken. And it was a beautiful piece, and we continued, and I've continued to this day to create these kinds of what we call cyber cities. The last one was at the Expo in Shanghai a few years ago. Next slide, please. Now, after the Venice Biennale, they linked me with a group called the Electronic Cafe International. Kit Galloway and Sherry Rabinowitz, who were two very, very amazing artist entrepreneurs out of California, who in the late 70s had created something called the Hole in Space. And it was actually a telepresence link, linking a storefront at Madison Avenue, New York, to a storefront on Sunset Boulevard in LA. And they didn't tell anyone, they just hooked this up over satellite. And people were just amazed. They were like, oh my God, it's sunset there? And suddenly people realized this linkage. So working with Sherry and Kit, they arranged that I would build a robot named Wilma the robot, and I would take it to Washington, D.C., and I would place it in front of the White House, and they would be at Comdex in Las Vegas, and they would allow people at Comdex, especially musicians and poets, to drive the robot around with their face on it and intercept people in front of the White House about this whole idea of what they called the information superhighway back then. And it was very successful, although it did almost get me thrown in jail. I mean, actually, if you tried this today, you actually probably would be shot on sight. But after the first couple of days of doing this in front of the White House, because we were at the Hayes Adams Hotel and we were actually right across from the White House, I got a knock on my door and I looked out and there was the hotel manager and the security and a police officer and a Secret Service agent, and there was an electronics warfare team, and there was a dog team for explosives, and the other people in the hotel were kind of wondering what was going on. And they said it wasn't illegal what I was doing, but they highly suggested that I let them in to have a look at the equipment I was using. So I didn't have any problem with this. But it was a very interesting project because it was the first time that telepresence, that robots were actually being controlled remotely on the streets. And it was a very powerful thing for people to be able to be confronted with this live and in person. Next slide, please. Wilma also went to Rome. The Italian Telecom had a TV special, and they wanted Wilma to appear in front of the Trevi Fountain, which again was an amazing experience. Next slide, please. And we continued doing these cyber cities with various people around the world. We showed it all over the world. In Japan, people could come in remotely. But it was Wilma the robot, which was the big hit. Next slide, please. And at the university, I had a series of researchers, Dr. Deborah Fells and Jutta Treviranus, who were working with kids with disabilities. And they came to me and they said, you know, the problem we have is these children, they have to go back to the hospital for therapies on a continual basis. They have to leave school and go for 1 or 2 months to have therapies, and they're becoming socially dysfunctional. They're losing their social connection to their friends and their learning environments. So why don't we take Wilma the robot and put it in the classroom and allow these students in the hospital to continue their education back at their normal schools. So we did this, but we soon found that robots in the classroom, I'm a teacher myself, and you know, I don't want my students roaming around as robots. I want them in their desk, actually. And robots run out of batteries, and they're big and heavy, and we just had so many problems that we started a project where at first we called it the supply student, but later it became Pebbles, providing education by bringing learning environments to students. And it was basically a stationary robot that would sit behind their desk, and the head would turn as they would look around, and it actually had a hand that they could wave to ask questions. And it was very successful because it created this sense of inclusion. They never left the classroom. Next slide, please. The U.S. Congress picked up this kind of idea and deployed about 50 of these through the Rainbow Children's Hospital, Stanford's Medical Center, all throughout the U.S. Many of these units were put in place. Now, the problem was that we were still using early video conferencing equipment. We were still using ISDN. These things cost about 50,000 euros or $50,000 for a pair. So it was incredibly expensive, although at the same time it was incredibly effective. It was an incredibly effective way at bringing a learning environment out of the classroom and into the home or the hospital that these kids were involved in. Next slide, please. And we continued to work with this kind of technology when I came over here to Europe. I left the company, my company Telbotics, which had developed this technology, and I had come here and started another series of telepresence projects. Echoes was a project that linked war veterans from the Canada back to the Netherlands. Next slide, please. And Moby the robot was a robot I developed with my students, which allowed, again, this idea of a remote presence to continue to explore other environments other than stationary ones. Next slide. And Moby Jr., which was the, yep. Is it okay? Okay. Okay. I think you have 10 more minutes, right? Yeah. 5 more minutes. Okay. Next slide, please. WebChair is a project that we're involved in here in the Netherlands using less expensive technology. Using Skype as an early version of this kind of technology. We're now using technology called video. And we have, next slide please, we have over 200 of these units in the Netherlands thanks to KPN. And it's actually been incredibly effective. It's been, these children do better at school than when they're actually in school because they want to be at school. There's no sense of exclusion. They want to go back. And the actual educational value of doing this is incredible. Next slide, please. We've also developed a much more portable version of the WebChair, which is something you can just pick up and take away. Next slide, please. And we actually went back and finished the project in 1986, where we used today's technology for the arm wrestling and the robots. Linking Rotterdam back to Toronto in the McLuhan program for McLuhan's 100th birthday a couple of years ago. Next slide. And we've introduced something called WebTeach, which is a way that schools can simply lease this technology for about $150 a month from us. And we supply the technology, the upgrades, the training, and everything else. And it might be something for Australia to look at, is this idea of simply leasing this kind of technology instead of buying it and becoming obsolete, the next year. Next slide, please. And we've now, in the process, developing a third version, which is more of a briefcase, so you can easily just take it from classroom to classroom as high school students need. Next slide, please. And my current research is looking at autism. We found that students who are using this system who are autistic, some of them started talking for the first time. And we found this link between this idea of a remote presence and people with autism. So we're now working with TU Eindhoven and the VRock School here to research how this can affect people with autism. Next slide, please. So if telepresence is the medium, what's the message? What was McLuhan talking about in this regard? Next slide, please. So, the one thing is the lecture hall. It's already kind of absurd that you have hundreds of kids sitting here when they can simply be somewhere else or see it remotely. Next slide, please. You can bring people like myself into a classroom now. I don't have to come to Australia. I don't have to have the expense. I can simply do this remotely. Next slide, please. Museums from a distance, robots, allowing people to explore museums or act as guides. And I think our next speaker will be talking much more about this. But yeah, this is the future. Next slide, please. And things like WebTeach, WebChair, bringing the students into the classroom. This idea of inclusion is incredibly important. These students who are using this technology, we've had nothing but positive results. And I think in the future, this is going to be the effect. Inclusion is going to be a right. Next slide, please. Just as with the kids with autism, they use the safe room in the school to come back into the classroom. That's how they use it. They want to be in class, they just can't handle the social pressure. And this kind of technology allows them to do that. Next slide, please. So education must shift from instruction, from imposing of stencils to discovery, to probing and exploration, and to the recognition of language of forms. This is what McLuhan was talking about, and this is what telepresence is going to bring to the educational environment. Next slide, please. And if anyone wants to contact me, please, this is our website and our contact information. We are looking at Australia as being something like Canada. It's a country with large expanses where you need to bring kids from remote areas into learning environments. And I think in the future, especially with the high-speed network being put in place and the cost of this kind of technology getting less and less and less, that you're going to see that McLuhan's idea of this kind of technology transforming education will become a reality in this decade. Thank you very much.
Thanks very much, Graham. What an innovative career you've had, and with an education background, what really meaningful things that you've brought into education. It was really fascinating to listen to. Does anyone have any questions for Graham?
I've got one. Graham, I'm sorry to be a dummy, but I am. Can you just tell me what McLuhan meant by the language of forms?
Sorry, can you repeat the question?
You put up a tantalizing quote about how education is changing, a quote from Marshall McLuhan, and how it's changing from a stencil to something more dynamic, and he referred to the language of forms. I just didn't understand what that meant. I'm curious about it.
Yeah, I think what he's talking about is we've been focused on the written word in language, and with media technology becoming more and more important, that it's this more of the idea of exploration of the web. You're actually actively involved, but also the idea that you're looking at form. You're not just looking at the symbolic representation of thing. You're actually looking at the form of it, the video, the image. This kind of idea of transforming from simply paper to something that's interactive and explorative, I believe. That's what he was talking about. And I think that's what telepresence technology does, is it allows for this kind of interaction to take place. It's not simply a one-way interaction, but you can actually interact with the media. You can interact with the form itself. And that's a big difference from a book, where you're simply given a quote and you have to go to the library and look it up on an encyclopedia. Now, what do? You go to Google, you look it up, you get a whole series of ideas on what it's about. So you're looking at a range of options of how to describe something. And I think that's what McLuhan was really getting at.
There's time for another question. Are there any other questions?
Thank you, Graham. It was a great presentation. I'm curious about WebTeach and how you think that might be applied in remote situations. Can you tell us a bit more about how you might...
Yeah, I mean, we're already doing that here. Like I say, we have over 200 of these deployed, and we have numerous ones in Belgium, France, Germany, the US. I mean, it's the idea of, instead of having to have a learning environment that people have to go to, you actually bring the people into the learning environment via this kind of remote technology. And it gives them what it does is it not only provides an interactive access to a classroom, but it creates a social sense. And that's what I think that the problem with most distant learning environments is there's no social connection. You still need sometimes to go and meet the other classmates. You still need to have your collective, your social environment. And that's what we found that this kind of technology is best at, is that it keeps the social aspect of learning. I mean, I was asked when I was in high school, I mean, what's the most important thing you're learning? Math, language. And I said to the teacher, no, it's how to interact with people. That's ultimately what education is about, it's about how to become social. And that's what we found with this kind of technology, is that in remote parts of Australia, these kids can actually come into a classroom. They can have a real presence. And the people in the class treat them. In fact, the kids in classes that we have these things in, because we've linked over 2,000 children, the students in the class say, no, that's not a web chair or web teach. That's my friend Yorit. They think of it as a person. And that's the difference between this and most other remote technologies. So I think it could have a profound impact in something like Australia, where you have so many remote communities, and it's so difficult to travel to school for a lot of kids.
I think that's about time. So thank you very much, Graham, for a really fascinating presentation today.
Thank you very much.